There is a kind of cold that does more than freeze water. It seems to slow time itself. It stiffens timber. It narrows breath. It makes every sound inside a cabin feel important. It turns a draft under the door into a fact you cannot ignore, and a weak latch into something almost moral, because if you neglect it, the wind will find out. In such a winter, cold is not just weather passing over a landscape. It is pressure. It presses on roofs. It presses into seams. It presses against lungs and patience and sleep. It teaches people to measure comfort in very small units, and safety in even smaller ones. Tonight, we are going north into that kind of winter, into a frontier world where the wind was not background, but structure. It shaped where a house could stand, how a chimney must be built, where a child should sleep, what a family feared after dark, and how often an ordinary day had to begin not with ambition, but with inspection. This is not a story of a single battle, or even of a single storm, though one storm will come in time. It is a story of holding warmth, holding walls, holding one another, holding a room together while the dark outside keeps testing every edge of it. It is also a story about the knowledge that grows in such conditions, the kind that rarely receives a title, rarely enters a grand archive in full, and yet passes from one pair of hands to another until whole communities survive a little better because somebody learned to hear the wind correctly. So let yourself settle. There is no need to brace. The people in this story already did that. We are only visiting now, listening to the weather they lived inside and to the patient intelligence they built beneath it. Let the room around you grow softer at the edges. Let the ordinary day fall away. Let the mind become willing to drift with a slow voice through snow, timber, smoke, and a long winter habit of endurance. Imagine an open land under a pale and indifferent sky. Snow lies in broad fields broken by stands of birch and pine. The light, when it comes weakly, as if it too were conserving strength. The air is clean enough to hurt. There are no stone streets here. No thick city walls. No dependable abundance of fuel brought in by well-managed wagons. There are only scattered cabins, low against the land, each one a small act of insistence set out in a place that seems to prefer emptiness. One of those cabins stands near the edge of a clearing. It is not large enough to look secure, yet it is all the security a family has. Its walls are rough timber, fitted with effort, and made tolerable by moss and clay pressed between the logs. Its roof is bark and sod under old snow. Its door is honest but imperfect. Its chimney works only as well as wind direction allows. Inside there is one room, one hearth, one sleeping platform. Perhaps a chest, perhaps a bench, perhaps some tools hung where they can dry, and perhaps a row of boots stiffening slowly in the cold whenever they are set too far from the fire. Before dawn, the room is almost dark. The family inside is not fully asleep. In frontier winters, sleep is rarely a full surrender. A portion of the mind remains with the fire, another remains with the door, another with the roof, another with the child who coughed at dusk. Outside, the wind has been moving since long before midnight, moaning low across the walls, and then sharpening suddenly through some narrow fault in the structure. A gust passes, and the latch answers it. A beam speaks once under load. Somewhere, under ash, the banked embers still glow, and the whole room depends on that faint red patience. The first adult to wake does not wake into silence. They wake into assessment. The floor is cold in a way that feels almost personal when bare skin first meets it. Drafts move low, close to the planks, touching the ankles before they touch anything else. A hanging hide near the north wall shifts slightly, telling the room that pressure outside has changed. The child closest to the edge of the bedding has worked free of part of a blanket. The older woman by the hearth is sleeping lightly, one hand still turned toward the ashes, as if she has not fully trusted the night to behave itself. This is the beginning of a winter day in deadly winds. Not drama first, not narrative first, condition first. Clothes go on in the order necessity has taught. Wool, if any, remains dry. A second layer. Boots with straw or scraps packed inside. A scarf or wrapping at the throat. Mittens, perhaps a fur cap. Perhaps a hood. No gesture is casual. Every piece of cloth has a memory attached to it. This seam wore thin last week. That boot's sole must be watched. That mitten cannot stay damp, or it will harden in such a life. Clothing is not style, it is architecture worn on the body. The door is open, and immediately the outside makes itself known. Wind enters first, taking heat with it. Snow at the threshold scatters inward in a powdery scrape. The face tightens against air so cold it feels thinner and sharper than ordinary air. Outside, the ground has changed shape in the night. One side of the cabin stands banked by drift, another half stripped clear. The chimney smoke does not rise straight, but tears sideways across the pale morning. The nearest trees stand dark, and the spaces between them seem large enough for all the wind in the world to gather speed. The cabin must be walked. This is as fixed a part of mourning as prayer might be in another household. A hand runs along the seam between logs. Moss that held yesterday now crumbles under pressure. A clay patch has split with a dark line. Ice has formed in one corner where moisture entered and then froze, creating a tiny wedge that will widen the weakness if ignored. The snow needs to be packed tighter at the base of the east wall. The north corner must be watched again. The eaves hold more weight than they should on one side. The chimney cap may have shifted. No one writes these things down. They are counted in the mind, and sometimes in the body, because the body remembers where the drafts were worst yesterday, and where the fingers numbed first during evening repairs. Then comes the labor of shaping snow. To anyone who has never lived in a cabin under winter assault, piling snow against a wall might look like surrender. But in such climates, snow is both threat and protection. Pack it right, and it insulates. Let it gather badly, and it becomes weight, moisture, collapse. So the shovel moves with judgment. Push, lift, press, step back, look. Pack the drift against the lower logs where still air is needed. Clear it from the wrong side where pressure grows dangerous. The work warms the body only just enough to continue. The wind strips that heat away almost immediately. Within minutes, cheeks sting, the eyes water. The hands begin their old aching argument inside the mittens. When the worker returns inside, the cabin feels warmer for a moment, but only because the body has been made colder. The hearth comes next. Fire is not just warmth, it is timing, fuel management, smoke control, and family morale. Too much wood, too soon, and the coals choke. Too little, and the room remains unlivable if the wind is turned. Smoke may descend before the chimney establishes its pull. If the draft is wrong, the whole cabin fills with the bitter gray taste of combustion half-trapped. A good winter fire is therefore less a blaze than a negotiation. Birch bark, if there is any, slivers of dry kindling, a patient hand at the ashes. A careful breath, then another. The ember glows, dims, glows again. A thread of flame lifts itself, wavers, then commits. There is profound comfort in that moment, though no one would waste time calling it beautiful. Flame means the room may be managed. It means porridge may happen. It means fingers can come back from numbness slowly enough not to become agony. It means the day has not started in failure. The family emerges with the fire. Children shift up into sitting shapes, blankets still around their shoulders. The old mother or father draws nearer to the heat and rubs the hands before extending them toward the hearth. Someone checks the water vessel. Someone else reaches behind a hanging blanket and presses the wall to feel how sharp the draft is there this morning. Even silence in such a room has function. People are not simply quiet. They are listening. Conversation, when it arrives, is practical and low. The north wall is worse. There is less dry wood than there should be. The chimney is drawing badly again. The roof must be checked before dark. The little one should not sleep near that corner tonight. This is not the language of abstraction. It is the grammar of continuation. Water must often be melted from snow, and this is an inefficient luxury no one can avoid. Grain is stirred into porridge. Bread, if there is bread, is softened. Sometimes a bit of dried fish is added. Often not. The family gathers near the fire, because the far edges of the room remain too cold to occupy for long. A child cups a warm bowl in both hands and relaxes for the first time that morning. Steam rises briefly. A spoon touches wood. For a few minutes, the room feels less like a defensive position and more like a household. That feeling will not last, but it matters anyway. The day's repairs begin in earnest. Bundled moss comes from storage, collected in other seasons against this exact need. Some kinds stay useful longer than others. The people living here know this not from books, but from repeated winters. The moss may be dampened slightly with melted snow, so it bends without snapping. A wooden packing tool pushes it deep between logs. Over it comes clay mixed with fibers of straw, smoothed in with fingers that lose warmth almost as fast as they work. Each seam has its own personality. Some repairs hold for days, some only until the next hard freeze. Some appear solid and hide a larger cavity beyond. One learns to read them through touch, sound, and habit. Animal hides are moved over the worst places. Blankets are rehung to trap still air behind them. A chest is shifted half a pace to interrupt a floor draft. A bench is turned. A child's bedding is moved toward the inner side. It is surprising how much of survival consists of this kind of subtle rearrangement. Not changing the whole world, only changing the shape in which the world meets your body. The door demands more attention than anyone wishes to give it. Doors in frontier cabins are rarely entirely trustworthy. Wood warps, thresholds wear, frames settle, latches strain. By late winter, the door may feel less like a single object than like a stubborn arrangement of compromised parts. Rags are pressed into seams. A second fastening is improvised. Sometimes a bucket, log, or chest is placed against the bottom edge before nightfall. To lie awake listening to a door shutter under pressure is to understand how thin the line between inside and outside can be. The roof is another matter altogether. It carries snow, wind, time, and memory. It was raised with effort everyone still remembers. Beams were hoisted, bark was laid, sod was spread, then winter began its own additions and corrections. Snow covers and insulates, but it also loads, wind lifts where it can. It searches under eaves, presses on one side, scours another. After certain storms, someone must climb with a long pole or shovel to push away the heaviest accumulation. This is slippery, dangerous work done not for improvement, but for prevention. A roof rarely asks for gratitude. It asks for attention by the time the weak daylight has thickened toward midday. Fatigue is already in the body. This is one of the hidden difficulties of such a life. Life. The work is often visually small, but physically and mentally immense. A seam patched, a drift shaped, a latch corrected, a hide moved, a roof checked to an outsider. Little seems to have happened, yet these small acts are what keep larger disasters from materializing. A cabin under winter wind is never truly finished. It is maintained into livability day by day. Inside, afternoon forms the first real pocket of comparative safety. The fire is established. Repairs have been made. The worst drafts are temporarily reduced. Wet mittens are turned toward drying. Split wood is stacked within reach. A child is given some task small enough to succeed at, and important enough to feel meaningful. The old mother sorts wool or peas or scraps of cloth. Someone mends, someone carves a peg or shaves a wedge. Someone sits for the first time all day and does not immediately rise again. This pocket of manageability matters more than comfort in the modern sense ever could. It is the part of the day in which a family remembers itself as something more than a defense against weather. Stories come out here, an old market farther south, a river journey, a season when the hay lasted unusually well, a wedding in another place under another kind of roof. Children listen half in belief and half in imagination. Adults listen with divided hearts because memory nourishes and wounds in equal measure. In rooms like this, tenderness survives in small forms. A blanket adjusted over a child's shoulder without waking them. A slightly larger share of warm broth given to the old one. A husband turning a draft with his own body while his wife tends the pot. A woman speaking to frightened children in a tone so even and low, it reshapes the room's emotional weather. Nothing here is grand. That is part of why it matters. Then evening begins by subtraction. The weak light at the window dims. The corners disappear first. The fire becomes not only warmth, but visibility. If there is a lamp, it may be lit, but fuel is precious and often reserved. More commonly, the hearth takes on the work of making the room exist in the eye at all. Shadows lie along the beams. Tools hanging on pegs lengthen into darker versions of themselves. A child's face glows briefly gold, and then turns away again into brown dimness. The evening meal resembles the morning meal with only small variations. Porridge again, perhaps, broth if enough has been saved, some softened root, rarely more. The family eats slowly because slow eating lengthens the illusion of plenty. Conversation stays low. Loudness feels wasteful in a room so bounded by effort. Practical matters dominate. The goat is eating less. The roof should be clear tomorrow, if the sky holds. The western seam may need to be reopened and repacked rather than patched over. The older child's boots are failing at the sole. No one asks whether this is a good life. That question belongs to people with alternatives. Here, the question is always narrower and more urgent. Is the room still holding well enough? Night, however, is where the deeper cost appears, because in daylight there are actions to perform. At night there is mainly listening. A person in such a cabin learns a full vocabulary of movement. A thin whistle means a narrow crack. A lower rush suggests a broader opening. A loose board or shutter gives a tapping or rattle. A roof beam under uneven snow load answers in one tone. A simple branch snapping outside answers in another. The body begins to sort these almost unconsciously. Some sounds allow sleep to continue. Others wake the whole mind at once. Children react to this world in different ways. One fears the roof sound. One fears the sudden violence of the latch under a strong gust. Another fears the long, low moaning that never quite becomes dramatic and is therefore harder to name. Adults learn to distribute tasks as a form of emotional management. Hold the lantern, bring the moss. Sit closer, keep the little one wrapped. These small instructions make fear useful, but adults are changed too. There is a peculiar psychological burden in living within a shelter that is always being tested. The outside begins to feel purposeful in its hostility, not because one literally believes the wind thinks, but because constant pressure acquires the texture of opposition. People touch their walls for reassurance. They recheck latches they have already checked. They develop rituals. Repairs happen in a preferred order. Tools are laid out the same way. Certain phrases are repeated at dawn. Such habits do not make the weather kinder. They make uncertainty slightly more bearable. The longer such winters last, the clearer one lesson becomes. Perfection is impossible. A rigid answer fails. A careless answer fails. A proud answer fails. The shelter that survives is the one repeatedly adjusted, repeatedly corrected, repeatedly listened to. The goal is not to build something flawless. It is to keep building something adequate enough to live inside through another night. This lesson shaped whole settlements, and in one of those settlements there grew a boy who would make that lesson his life. His name, according to later memory and fragments in regional record, was Seion Gregorvich. He was born not into established security, but into an unfinished frontier. The settlement of his childhood was young enough that many roofs still reflected hurry more than wisdom. Families had come north under the usual mixture of hope, debt, pressure, rumor, and necessity that populated so many edges of empire. Cabins were raised quickly because winter would not wait. Logs were rough, gaps were large, chimneys were serviceable at best. Every family was learning at once, and often learning through discomfort first. Seion's father was strong and persistent, a man with good laboring hands, but not the sort of inherited building knowledge that matched this climate from the start. His mother held the room together through rationing, mending, storing, tending the fire, and watching the children with the exact form of attention harsh weather teaches. They were siblings. There was one sleeping platform. There were nights when the family woke to check the embers more often than they slept. What separated Seion from others was not that he disliked hardship more. It was that he watched it more carefully. He noticed where frost formed first on the inside wall. He noticed the northwestern corner failed more often. He noticed that snow against one wall could improve comfort even while threatening weight elsewhere. He noticed that one whistle in the night meant one kind of trouble, and another tone meant another. The cabin itself became his first teacher. Then came the storm that fixed his attention permanently. It was late winter, that dangerous time when supplies are thinner. Vigilance is older, and hope sometimes becomes incautious. The storm built through the day and intensified toward night until it stopped feeling like weather and began feeling like pressure with a direction and a will. Seion woke to a new sound, sharper than the ordinary complaints of a strained roof. His father shouted. His mother gathered the children. Then timber above them gave way. The collapse came in a rush of noise and white. A beam cracked. Snow fell inward. Cold entered at once. The room ceased to be a room and became wreckage. The child remembered later, not a sequence so much as fragments. His mother's eyes, his brother crying, a hand pulling him upward, snow in the mouth, wind moving through the broken house as if the house had never really had the right to call itself shelter. The family escaped into the storm and fought their way to a neighbor's cabin. The distance was not great, and in that weather felt almost impossible. Wind pushed against them with such force that each step had to be argued for. Another family opened the door. Another room made itself smaller, so more frightened bodies could fit within it. The village survived itself through such compressions of private life into communal necessity. When Seion returned later to the remains of his home, the lesson was everywhere. The walls still stood, but the heart had failed. Tools were broken or lost, clothing ruined, the family chest split, the room crushed. A little world turned suddenly into scattered objects under snow. Many children would remember this mainly as fear. Seion remembered fear and a question. Why that beam? Why that angle? Why that roof? Why theirs? Why not another's? The rebuild became his education. He followed the work. Why cut there? Why support here? Why choose this log and not that one? Why this roof pitch? Why this moss? Why that chimney form? At first, adults answered in the broad way. Adults answer any curious child. But Seion's questions pressed deeper. He wanted principles. He wanted pattern. He wanted to know what separated strength and failure. As he grew, he developed a reputation that began in amusement and ended in respect. He heard the wind differently. A narrow crack produced one note, a loose board another, a poor chimney draw another. He could stand inside a cabin and locate weakness by ear, often before another person found it by hand. He watched snowdrifts and learned what they revealed about prevailing pressure. He saw that cabins sited too proudly on exposed rises suffered mold, while those set a little lower or broken by terrain endured better. He compared roof angles, seam quality, door orientation, timber straightness, and the behavior of different chinking materials under repeated freeze. He was not a scholar in the formal sense. Frontier life rarely allowed for that. But he became an analyst of survival. By adulthood, families sought his opinion when building or repairing. He would circle a house, feel the walls, study the lie of the roof, the direction of the prevailing wind, the accumulation of snow, the behavior of smoke, and then offer advice so practical it sounded almost plain. Brace this corner, repack this seam before the next freeze. Shift the wood pile to break the door draft. Steepen the roof if you can. Recess the entrance. Do not trust that beam another winter. People started calling him the wind reader. At first, the name carried a little teasing, because communities always have teased what they do not yet understand. Later it became respect. Too many of his warnings proved correct. He married a woman named Ekaterina, whose strength was of the quieter frontier kind. She understood domestic weather. She knew what smoke did to a room, what drafts did to children, what a household needed to remain not only physically functional, but emotionally livable. She recognized in Seion something more valuable than brute strength. He was exact. He prepared. He wasted less by thinking longer. That matters in every climate. It matters more in one where error can become fatal. Together, they built their home differently. The site was chosen for shelter rather than appearance. The logs were selected with unusual care. The roof rose more steeply than common fashion might have preferred. The door was recessed to buffer the rush of entering cold. The chimney was shaped to resist downdrafts, better than the simple forms many used by default. These were small improvements, but survival often lives inside small improvements. When the first major storm struck their new home, Ekaterina listened to the wind and heard not chaos, but resistance. Not silence, because silence was impossible, but the sounds were of pressure being held, not of failure advancing. That difference gave the room something rare on the frontier. Confidence when children came, Seion's care deepened further. A baby in such a place changes every draft into a moral issue. So he built a warmer inner sleeping space near the stove, positioned to hold heat while avoiding smoke danger. He shaped the interior climate as carefully as he had shaped the exterior shell. This is one of those frontier acts history almost never preserves properly. The small domestic innovation that keeps one child safer and then becomes, by imitation, a technique others use too. Their household settled into the long frontier rhythm. Spring for mud and repair, summer for cutting, gathering, storing, autumn for sealing, reinforcing, preparing, winter for vigilance and maintenance. Seion taught his son through work rather than instruction alone. He taught him how to test chinking with the thumb, how to hear draft through tone, how to judge snow load by roof sound and drift behavior, how to decide which repairs were urgent and which could wait. Ekaterina taught the daughter, and the daughter watched everything, how cloth altered airflow, how the smallest child was placed between adults during severe nights, how to keep a room from becoming emotionally colder than it already was physically. Then illness entered the house. Ekaterina developed the sort of winter cough families, dreaded precisely because it was so ordinary at first. A little weakness, a little fever, a slight improvement, then relapse in cabins where smoke, labor, cold air, and fatigue were constant companions. Small illness could turn serious slowly enough to keep hope alive, and then betray it. Seion did what he could. He improved the draft. He managed the fire more carefully. He kept the room as stable as possible. He prepared better food where he could. But knowledge does not grant control over everything. Sometimes it only makes one more aware of the limits. While she lay weak, the settlement entered the path of a storm people would remember for years. It rose through the afternoon with a steadiness that frightened everyone more than sudden violence might have done. By dusk, the wind had become difficult. By full dark, it had become something else. Snow no longer fell so much as traveled. Cabins shook under sustained pressure. Roofs and latches and chimneys were being tested everywhere at once. Seion's own house held. That fact gave him safety and burden at the same time. Inside there was an ill wife, frightened children, and a fire that had to be managed carefully. Outside there were neighbors whose cabins he already knew too well to trust through such a night. He knew which roof had been patched in autumn. He knew which door latch was weak. He knew who had an elderly couple, who had a newborn, who lived alone, who had built too quickly because winter had arrived before wisdom did. He listened, and the wind carried him information he did not want. A particular crash in one direction, a long rattle in another. The shifting pitch of structural distress. This is where lesser versions of the story become loud and simple. But real frontier decisions are rarely loud and simple. He did not deliver a speech. He stood in his own room and faced obligations that were all true at once. Stay, and he protected what was his most immediately. Go, and he risked leaving that protection thinner. Ekaterina understood before he spoke. Her knowledge of him was as exact as his knowledge of wind. She said one word, go. That single word carried permission, grief, trust, and necessity together. It released him without making the choice easier. It merely made it possible. He dressed in every useful layer: wool, felt, leather, mittens over gloves. A scarf-bound hide, rope, hammer, wedges, strips of hide. A lantern he knew the wind would fight at once. He told his son what to do. Tend the fire, keep the bar on the door, stay near your mother. Do not waste heat. Do not open unless you must. These are impossible instructions for a child and entirely normal ones in hard conditions. Then he opened the door and stepped into the storm. The wind struck like a physical thing. Snow crossed the dark sideways, lit only in the lantern's narrow, trembling sphere. Beyond a few arm lengths, there was almost nothing. The settlement, though familiar, had become a world known only by memory, step count, and instinct. He moved first toward the cabin whose roof he had always mistrusted most. There he found the old couple under partial failure, snow driving into the room through a gap where the roof had begun to give. No noble solution existed. He braced, wedged, reduced the opening, bought them hours. At another cabin, the latch had failed, and the door had been blown inward enough to let snow gather across the threshold and into the room. The fire was nearly gone. He cleared, tied, pinned, and restarted. At another, a beam had cracked, and the family beneath it had frozen into fear. He showed them where to support, how to shift weight, how to prop until morning. At another, He retrieved salvaged items from a room no longer safe enough to stay in, and moved them into a neighboring shed so a family that had already lost shelter would not lose every useful belonging too. This was the pattern of the night, cabin after cabin, emergency after emergency. Not heroism in the polished sense, only necessary knowledge under pressure. His hands lost feeling and regained it in pain. Snow hardened on shoulders and sleeves. The lantern burned low and had to be refilled from another household supply. Men younger than him followed instructions they would not have needed on an easier night. Women held children and cleared paths and kept embers alive. The settlement revealed both its fragility and its strength. What held it together was not courage alone, but knowledge shared through action. Eventually, the wind lessened from unbearable to merely severe. Shapes of cabins emerged again in the dark. Doors opened a little. Voices could be heard. Seion kept moving until he was certain he had missed no one. Only then did he turn home. The journey back was short and endless. The body often behaves this way after prolonged emergency. It spends itself fully only when the last necessary task is complete. By the time his own door opened to him, he was nearly finished. The interior air, warmer than outside, felt almost painful. His children helped with the frozen outer layers. Ekaterina watched from the bedding, still ill, still present, seeing at once how much the night had taken from him. He slept beside the hearth, with the heavy depth of someone who has crossed beyond ordinary fatigue. By daylight, word had already spread. The old couple lived because the roof had been braced. Another family kept their fire because the door had been secured. A sagging house still stood because a support had been placed before full collapse. People came with gratitude, and Seion accepted it without becoming easy under it. Because the other truth of the night was that he had spent it away from his own wife and children. Frontier virtue is often complicated in exactly this way. To answer one need is to leave another exposed. Ekaterina recovered slowly. The settlement repaired slowly, but most importantly, the storm changed behavior. People built differently afterward. The old weak-roofed angles became less acceptable. Door latches were reinforced. Chimneys were altered. Roof loads were watched more carefully. New settlers listened sooner when warned. The community's baseline improved. This is perhaps Seion's truest legacy, not the dramatic night alone, but the better normal that followed it. One man cannot eliminate winter, but he can help teach a settlement how not to meet winter foolishly. His method spread, some through direct instruction, some through imitation, some through the simple frontier logic that what survives is copied. He walked building sites with new families and told them, sometimes gently and sometimes with necessary bluntness, when they were making avoidable mistakes. He pointed out where the land would expose them too much, where a drift would form badly, where a door ought to face elsewhere, where a roof pitch should be steeper, where a chimney form would betray them in a hard north wind. He shared what he knew freely, because community safety was not abstract on the frontier. Another family's better cabin meant fewer midnight rescues, fewer deaths, less strain on everyone else. Knowledge here was not prestige, it was mutual aid in its most practical form. His children grew up inside this improved world. The son learned to hear, to test, to compare. The daughter learned to warm, arrange, soothe, and structure the inner room. Both kinds of skill mattered equally. A roof keeps out wind. A wise room keeps out despair. Years later, when Seion had grown older, he climbed less and listened more. Younger people did the hauling and the roof clearing, but still came to him for judgments. He would stand with a hand to a wall, or beneath a roof line, or near a chimney and say, not much, only enough. Repack this, watch that, move the bedding, wait for thaw. Strengthen before next storm. Such sentences were not literary, but they were the poetry of continued life. Over time, pieces of his knowledge ceased to belong to him alone. They became custom. People forgot which improvements had first been his. That is how practical genius often disappears. It becomes ordinary, and therefore invisible, when later generations look back at frontier settlements like his through excavation. Records, journals, and oral memory. They encountered the same problem historians so often do with ordinary people. The grander homes survived better in the material record. Elite buildings, better built and better maintained, left clearer traces. Wealthier families wrote more. Officials described the frontier from their own vantage. Documents preserved privilege more readily than necessity. So archaeology gives us an uneven map. We find foundations of better houses, more durable chimneys, better fittings, more complete household remains among the wealthy. The poor, whose homes were lighter, more repeatedly repaired, more vulnerable to rot, reuse, dismantling, and collapse, leave subtler traces. A patch in the soil, a hearth stain, a broken hinge, a ghost of a wall line. Reconstructing ordinary winter life means reading between fragments and refusing to mistake surviving evidence for typical evidence. Still, enough remains to feel certain things. Cabins were often smaller than comfortable imagination prefers. Repairs were not occasional, they were constant. Doorways mattered enormously. Chimney design was more sophisticated than naive reconstructions often assume. Snow was both threat and tool. The line between a livable room and a dangerous one could be very thin. There are traces, too, of class difference under the same wind. Not every frontier resident spent winter in the same kind of structure. Merchants, officials, wealthy settlers, clergy, and certain administrative families had access to better materials, more labor, better stoves, and more spare supplies. Their homes might have glass windows rather than high coverings, brick or better constructed chimneys, separate rooms, multiple fires, courtyards or outbuildings arranged to block the worst of the wind, candles enough for reading, servants enough that maintenance could be performed without every member of the family doing it by hand. This did not mean the wealthy escaped winter. It meant they encountered it through thicker buffers. A settler child feared drafts across a bedding platform. An elite child feared the storm through glass, and still worried, but from greater safety. A poor household watched every scene. A wealthy one could hire craftsmen for repairs or buy scarce supplies at inflated prices when others could not. Privilege did not make the wind gentle. It made resistance more available, and yet frontier wealth was never absolute in the way metropolitan wealth liked to imagine itself. Windows could still shatter, brick chimneys could still fail, roofs could still crack under snow, supply caravans could still be delayed or lost, servants could still fail to arrive in hard weather. There were nights when elite families discovered, to their distress, that all comfort rested on systems more fragile than they had allowed themselves to believe. Sometimes great storms blurred hierarchy for a day or two. A wealthy home with strong walls might shelter a poorer family whose cabin had failed. This was partly charity, partly pragmatism, partly communal realism. A dead settlement benefited no one. In such moments, classes that ordinarily kept their distance shared air, fear, and inconvenience. Afterwards, the distinctions usually returned, but memory kept some account of who opened doors and who did not. The contrast between elite and common winter life reveals something almost philosophical about the frontier. The wind itself was indifferent to hierarchy. It blew with the same force against mansion and cabin, governor's house and widow's shack, merchant's roof and settler's door. What differed was the thickness and quality of the answer waiting on the other side. Better walls, more labor, more fuel, more room, more time, more knowledge, more margin for error. That margin matters. It is in many ways the hidden history of comfort. Still, there is a danger in looking only at inequality and missing the more intimate human truth. Even the well-sheltered listened to storms. Even the privileged knew some winter fear. Even the wealthy understood, however dimly, that beyond their warmer rooms was a season bigger than them. And among the poor, there was not only suffering, but also extraordinary competence. It is too easy for later ages to mistake hardship for ignorance. In reality, severe conditions often produce forms of intelligence that comfortable people never need to acquire. A frontier woman managing drafts, fire, bedding, and the emotional weather of children during a storm, those things no formal treatise fully teaches. A settler man reading roof pitch and wind tone by memory and sound knows things no elegant architect from a distant city would intuit instantly in the same conditions. The poor may leave fewer written explanations, but they often hold the most hard-won knowledge. This is why ordinary people matter so much in the history of shelter. Their names often fade, their techniques do not, When we speak now of insulation, weather stripping, storm preparation, site choice airflow, and resilient construction, we speak in more advanced terms of problems generations before us solved with moss, hide bark, packed snow, intuition, repetition, and shared warning. What they learned became custom. What became custom became practice. What became practice eventually became design standards, technologies, industries, and the nearly invisible comforts of modern rooms. So as this story drifts toward its close, it becomes less a tale of one frontier man or one settlement than of inheritance. The walls around you now, whatever they are made of, belong to a long lineage of trial and correction. Someone, once, learned the cost of a poor seal, a bad latch, a wrong roof pitch, a weak draft. Someone woke in the dark and discovered what failed. Someone repacked moss with numb fingers. Someone moved a child away from a draft. Someone shared a better way with a neighbor. Someone improved a chimney. Someone opened a door in a storm. The shelter you know so casually is the heir to countless such acts. This is not a reason for guilt. It is a reason for a softer kind of gratitude. A draft in a modern room is an annoyance. Once it could be a nightly fact of life. A heating failure is now often a repair call. Once it might mean a long, desperate labor with inadequate fuel, and a mind that never fully rested. Children today, in many places, sleep without learning the sound of a roof under dangerous weight, or the exact note of a door latch in sustained wind. That too is history, though of a gentler kind. If any image remains from tonight, let it be a simple one. A low cabin under snow, a thread of smoke, a family gathered close, outside, the wind surging and moving and pressing as it always has. Inside, not luxury, not ease, only enough warmth, enough skill, enough patience, enough structure held together one more night. Then let that image soften. Let the clearing fade into white distance. Let the roof settle under snow. Let the old voices of wind and timber become farther and farther away until they are only memory. Return now to your own room, to the walls that do not need your hands tonight, to the door you do not need to brace, to the roof you do not need to climb and judge before dawn. To the warmth that is already here, there is nothing to inspect now, nothing to repack, nothing to brace, nothing to listen for except your own breathing and the easy quiet that follows the story, well past its hardest weather. You are not required to keep watch tonight. Others did that long ago. They kept the fires. They studied the seams. They learned the wind's moods. They passed on what worked. Part of that effort has already reached you. So let the body rest inside, inherited shelter. Let the shoulders loosen. Let the jaw soften. Let thoughts become slower, smaller, and less exposed. The storm is over. The cabin is holding. The fire is banging. Morning is not yet here, and there is one more thing worth noticing before the room grows completely quiet. A settlement like Seion's was never made only of storms. Storms are what memory preserves because they produce edges sharp enough for story. But most lives were not lived at the edge. They were lived in the long middle, in afternoons of mending, in mornings of repacking seams, in weeks when the roof held, and therefore no one spoke much about it, in seasons when the greatest labor was not rescue, but preparation. History often leaps from event to event, because events are easy to name. Yet real endurance is built in the unnamed spaces between them. Think of the settlement after the famous storm had passed, and repairs had become more orderly again. Think of the days in which people walked from cabin to cabin, not because anything had collapsed that morning, but because winter still required an accounting. A neighbor came to borrow a brace, another returned a rope. Someone needed advice on where to move a sleeping platform, because the draft along the floor kept finding the infant's feet. Someone else had discovered that one kind of moss, gathered from a bog farther into the trees, held better than the usual kind, and wanted to share the knowledge before deep freeze sealed the ground too hard to gather more. That is how practical civilization expands in difficult places. Not with fanfare, but by transfer, a better hinge copy, a better threshold improvised, a steeper roof no longer dismissed as needless effort. A child taught to hear the difference between a dangerous sound and an ordinary one. A woman shown how to hang hides and blankets in a layered way that traps still air more effectively. A young man told not to trust a certain kind of green timber, no matter how convenient it is to cut. These things do not seem, at first glance, large enough to change history. And yet history, when it touches ordinary life, is often nothing more than the accumulation of such changes, until a generation later, a room was measurably safer than the room that preceded it. In Seion's settlement, winter shaped social life as much as it shaped buildings. People could not afford to think of one another only in terms of affection. They had to think in terms of reliability, who could be counted on in darkness, whose word about a weak being was worth trusting, which family repaid borrowed fuel, which old man exaggerated his stores out of pride, and which widow understated her need out of habit. Human character became legible under pressure, because pressure has a way of revealing what comfort disguises. Children grew up in this atmosphere, and inherited more than cold. They inherited scales of judgment. They learned which adults remained steady when frightened, which ones became angry, which ones withdrew into silence, which ones kept humor alive in ways that softened the room, and which ones made everyone colder than the draft itself. A settlement does not survive on timber alone. It survives on temperaments compatible enough with fear to keep people from undoing one another. There were marriages formed under these conditions that would seem strange to those who imagine love only in its expressive forms. On the frontier, love was often preparation, competence, and nearness under pressure. A husband who cleared the roof before a wife asked. A wife who banked the fire so well that a newborn never had to wake into the worst cold. A couple who spoke little during a storm, because both were listening to the same wall and trusting the other to hear what needed hearing. A hand placed briefly over another at the table when the children were not looking. A blanket shared without comment, because both knew fuel was running low and body heat would have to answer where wood could not. Older people altered the settlement too, not only by labor remembered from their youth, but by carrying long comparisons. They remembered which winters had been harsher and which merely longer. They remembered what had once been normal and no longer had to be. They remembered the first years when every other chimney drew badly, and how now only a few still did. In this way, the old became historians of comfort, though no one used that phrase. They could point at an improved latch and remember the season before such latches were common. They could look at children sleeping near dry walls and remember when damp inner logs were treated as unavoidable. This memory mattered because it gave shape to improvement. Without memory, every gain appears natural. With memory, it appears earned. As the children of the settlement matured, they carried the knowledge into new cabins of their own. A son did not build as his grandfather had built, but as his father had revised. A daughter did not arrange a room as her mother's mother had arranged one, but with added refinements learned across multiple winters. In this way, progress on the frontier was not linear in the proud modern sense. It was iterative, a little less draft, a little less smoke, a little less fear, a little more predictability, a little more skill transferred before the next hard season arrived. Sometimes the settlement still failed despite all this. A roof collapsed, a child sickened, a store of grain spoiled. An animal died at the wrong point in the season. A family left because the arithmetic of staying no longer made sense. These failures matter too, because they remind us that improvement does not eliminate vulnerability. It redistributes it, it lowers some risks, raises others, and leaves chance in the structure of life, no matter how wise the residents become. That was one reason Seion's authority felt trustworthy. He did not speak as if wisdom had conquered weather. He spoke as if wisdom improved the odds and made foolish suffering less common. In a place where false certainty could kill, that modesty mattered. He could say this roof is better, not this roof is invincible. He could say this winter may be survivable, not this winter is safe. He could say move the bedding, repack the seam, bank more fuel, clear the drift, watch the child, and people listened because his counsel was made of realities they could test with their own hands. If we linger in the settlement a little longer, we can imagine the years after Seion's children were grown. The son perhaps takes a wife. The daughter perhaps joins another household nearby, or remains long enough to become indispensable to parents aging into stiffness and memory. The grandchildren arrive into better rooms than Seion himself knew in childhood. Not perfect rooms, and not comfortable by any generous standard, but better. The roof pitch is wiser, the entry is better sheltered, the fire draws more cleanly, the sleeping arrangements keep infants farther from floor drafts. These grandchildren may never fully understand the terror of the old collapse, that shaped their grandfather because that is what successful improvement does. It makes former dangers seem almost excessive in retrospect. This may be one of the tenderest facts in all of history. The best work of one generation often appears to the next as normal life. A safer room does not announce itself every morning. It merely fails to terrify, and because children grow quickly accustomed to whatever protects them, they may never know how much thought was buried in the shape of the walls around them. They hear less of the wind, not because the world has become kind, but because someone else already listened hard enough on their behalf. As the settlement matures, the social geometry changes too. More cabins appear, paths are worn in more clearly between them. Shared labor becomes slightly more organized because there are enough experienced households now to spread certain burdens. Someone has a better sled, someone has a stronger saw, someone begins experimenting with windbreaks made from stacked logs or woven fencing around exposed sides. Someone else learns that planting a line of saplings, though slow to yield, may soften the attack of air years later. The village becomes not only a collection of shelters, but a collection of learned responses. Festive occasions, when they occur, are shaped by the climate as well. Midwinter feast days are quieter than people elsewhere might imagine, because fuel must still be considered, roads remain difficult, and no one dares waste too much food for symbolism alone. Yet there are still gatherings, shared meals, a little singing, children washed more carefully than usual, if water can be spared, an icon polished, a corner decorated with some small remnant of beauty. Such moments matter because they remind everyone that life is not merely maintenance. Even in hard places, people insist on meaning, frontier religion. 2. Takes on the texture of weather. Official forms persist where priests can visit, and where icons survive the damp and smoke. But prayer becomes highly practical in a cabin under strain. People pray for roofs to hold, for children's fevers to break, for storms to turn, for snow not to load too heavily, for a husband to return from a wood-gathering trip delayed by wind. Ritual and repair lie close together. A hand may touch an icon, and then immediately test the latch. Not because faith is weak, but because in these rooms divine hope and practical action were never experienced as enemies. When we step outward from the settlement, and consider what the wider state or empire understood of such places, the gap becomes striking. Officials counted households, livestock, yield, obligations, losses. They described settlements as expanding, stabilizing, or productive. These words were not false, but they were thin. They did not capture the ongoing intimacy between structure and weather. A report might note that a village survived a difficult winter. It would not note the exact number of times a mother woke to reposition a child away from the wall, or how many mornings a father found snow under the door and realized the latch had nearly failed, or how much of the population's true intelligence was spent on preventing small disasters invisible to governance. This is another reason the archaeology of such places matters so much. It does not merely uncover objects, it gives texture back to categories that administration had flattened. A repaired threshold says more about lived winter than a tax line ever could. A rebuilt chimney tells us how smoke and wind once negotiated over a family's lungs. A packed earth floor worn smooth in one section and rough in another tells us where people clustered for heat, where they passed, where they avoided, where life condensed. Material remains become intimate when we ask them the right question. Imagine an archaeologist centuries later, kneeling where one of these cabins once stood. The roof is gone, the walls are half inferred. The stove stones remain. Perhaps a scatter of nail fragments, charred beams, soiled differences marking where structure once resisted the weather. In the wealthier houses farther away, preservation is better. There are more artifacts, more imported wares, more evidence of status. But here, in the poorer room, what survives is often more haunting precisely because it is incomplete. A broken spoon, a hinge, a line of compacted clay, the ghost of a partition. These traces require imagination not to distort them, but to accompany them. The archaeologist may know, in abstract terms, that winters were severe. Yet severity becomes more real when one sees repeated wall repairs, or multiple chimney modifications, or unusual thickening at a doorway. It becomes more real when one realizes this room was not just built, but continuously adjusted. The house was thinking through its occupants. Their labor remained embedded in every revision. There is also the archaeology of absence. Missing glass because glass was too scarce. Missing durable tableware because wood or coarse clay served instead. Missing elaborate fittings because none had ever been present. Missing children's objects because childhood itself was folded into utility, and what existed was made from materials too perishable to survive. Such absences can be painful to read, but they are honest. They tell us where resources did not flow, where comfort did not settle, and how much of ordinary human life vanishes unless someone makes deliberate effort to see it. By contrast, the larger or wealthier houses of the same region preserve abundance more readily. Window fittings survive, better stoves survive, decor survives, imported ceramics survive, account books sometimes survive. In those rooms, winter appears in the record as inconvenience managed through resources. In the poorer cabins, winter appears as pressure met through attention. Both are histories of shelter, only one more easily becomes heritage in a prestigious sense. Let us step for a while into one of those wealthier houses, not to abandon Seion's world, but to understand the full social weather of the frontier. The house stands higher, its walls are more regular, the roof is heavier and better framed. There may be several rooms, perhaps even an entry space that catches the worst cold before it reaches the main interior. The windows are broader, the stove or furnace more substantial. Fuel is not infinite, but less anxiously counted. Servants or hired labor may handle some maintenance. Food stores are deeper, textiles are better, people sleep farther apart, and therefore with more privacy, though perhaps also with less immediate body warmth to share. The wind still sounds against the walls, but more distantly. It is weather again, not a hand trying at every seam. A merchant's wife in such a house may still dislike the storms, may still dread the worst roads, may still worry about delayed goods, illness, or the temper of the servants confined too long indoors. Children may still wake at night when a gust strikes. Men may still check roofs and chimneys with real concern. But the emotional scale is different. They worry farther from disaster. That is one of privilege's quietest luxuries. Even their conversation about winter differs. A settler household discusses whether the latch will hold, whether the roof can wait another day, whether a child may safely sleep near that wall. A wealthy household may discuss whether a journey should be postponed, whether fuel costs are rising, whether a chimney sweep must be summoned, whether guests will still arrive for a feast day. The same storm blows, the forms of anxiety it produces, reveal class more clearly than clothing sometimes can. Yet the wealthy depend, often invisibly, on the labor and knowledge of those lower in the hierarchy. They purchase fuel cut by others. They eat from supplies hauled by others. They live in houses built, repaired, and stabilized by craftsmen whose own homes may be much poorer. They inhabit a buffer from winter, sustained by a wider world of winter labor. The frontier is full of such hidden dependencies. Comfort sits on unseen work. This does not reduce all class relations to simple cruelty. Human life is rarely that neat. Wealthier households could be generous. They could lend tools, shelter neighbors during emergencies, distribute fuel, pay craftsmen fairly, or do the opposite of all these things. But the architectural contrast remains a fact even when moral character varies. Warmth, like most protections, gathers unevenly. Now let us return from those larger houses to the settlement of low cabins, because that is where the true mood of this story lives. By old age, Seion would have understood that his own life had not been remarkable in the way official history prefers. He had not changed the empire, he had not written laws, he had not led armies, yet he had altered, in small practical ways, the probability that children in his settlement were warm enough to keep sleeping. He had reduced the number of roofs that failed, he had improved the ordinary. This is a form of historical importance almost too quiet for easy praise. Perhaps that is why it suits a bedtime history so well. The line between safety and danger in such places was rarely marked by dramatic speeches. It was marked by repeated competent acts, a scene packed in time, a stronger prop under a beam, a better understanding of where the wind entered, a calmer room because one adult knew how to steady 3 frightened children while another worked at the door. These things do not glitter, they endure. and endurance is what we have been listening to all night. Not a single famous moment, but the larger human habit of refusing to surrender the room. If you imagine the settlement now, very late winter, after many months of this life, you can feel how altered everyone is by it. Faces are narrower, hands are rougher, clothing is patched in maps of old wear. Children are quieter for longer stretches. The old move more carefully. Adults speak with the economy that fatigue encourages. And yet the village still exists. Smoke still rises. Paths still connect one door to another. Someone still goes for water. Someone still repacks the wall. Someone still banks the fire for night. A season so harsh it might appear impossible from afar is being lived not by miracle, but by repetition. This is one reason spring on the frontier often feels less like joy than release mixed with disbelief. The thaw comes grudgingly. Snow recedes in ugly stages. Drifts turn gray. Mud appears. Water moves. Where there had been hard certainty. Roofs drip. The ground reveals what winter had hidden. Broken things come back into view. Fences slant. Tools emerge. Paths become heavy with melt. The first true soft air can feel almost unreal after months of breathing cold, sharpened by fear. Yet spring brings no idleness. It brings urgency in another language. Repairs must be made before next year. Moss must be gathered when conditions permit. Timber must be cut. Roofs must be reworked while they can be safely climbed. Drainage must be improved. Stores must be rebuilt. In this way, even relief becomes labor, but it is a different labor. It contains horizon. The body can believe in preparation again, because the weather's not trying to kill him at every hour. And perhaps that is how Seion himself understood life by then. Not as a fight to be won once, but as a cycle of learning, correcting, preparing, and handing forward. A wiser roof, a safer room, a child who never learns one particular fear because someone else already did. That thought can come back with us now into the present. Your own walls, whatever their flaws, are part of that same long inheritance. Somewhere far behind them, in the ancestry of shelter, stand rooms like Sion's and hands like his, and the Katerina's and the unnamed neighbors who borrowed. Warned, copied, opened doors, and shared what worked. Safety did not arrive in one week. It arrived through long chains of modest human intelligence. Perhaps that is why quiet gratitude feels like the right final mood. Not guilt, not even admiration alone. Only a softer awareness that your room did not begin with you. The sealed window, the better roof line, the trustworthy latch, the warmer bed, the expectation that you may sleep through the night without waking to inspect the wall. These are not natural givens. They are history made comfortable enough to be invisible. And now, since comfort is already here, you do not need to walk the perimeter. You do not need to test the chimney. You do not need to move a child away from a draft. You do not need to decide whether the roof can wait until morning. You do not need to calculate how much wood remains. That labor belongs to another century. The people who carried it have long since laid it down. The settlement is quiet now under snow and memory. The famous storm is over. The unnamed repairs are over. The children grew. The elders died. The roofs changed, and the lessons passed on. What remains for you is not the burden, only the shelter. So let the frontier recede. Let the low cabins fade one by one into the pale landscape. Let the smoke thin and vanish into the cold morning sky. Let the wind continue far away where it no longer touches you. And let your own room become very simple again. Walls, breath, darkness, warmth, rest, and sleep can come now without needing to be defended. Good night.